Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and I'm here with my sidekick, who I thought, since he just turned one, I thought this would be an appropriate time for him to make his debut. Say hi, bud. Can you wave? Say hi. So yeah, he just turned one, so he's ready to hit the big leagues, ready to hit the big time, you know. He and I have both been doing a lot of research lately, a lot of reading, and we're really eager to share that with everybody. Yeah. I think everyone should have kids, by the way. I think that it actually contributes to a much fuller understanding of the meaning of life, the nature of the human subjectivity, like the nature of learning, etc. But anyway, he wanted to check in and say hi, introduce himself. So there's that. Now I'll get to the content of the video. Say bye, bud. Say bye bye. Can you say bye bye? Can you say bye bye? Good boy. I want to talk to you a little bit today about class, the question of class, the structure of class in America, class politics, class-based analyses of society. There seems to be an ongoing kind of internal civil war or something on the left right now. I've been seeing lots of accusations of being class reductionist hurled by people who basically want to stick to intersectional politics. And there's kind of a new cohort of people on the left who are increasingly trying to reassert the importance of class-based analyses and are realizing sort of problems with the intersectional framework and its sort of the kind of corporate backing of it and what that means, etc. So like I had this interesting argument on Twitter. Just if you'll forgive us a slight detour. There's a prominent YouTuber who is accusing some people of being class reductionists. Zero Books, Douglas Lane, he's an important person on the left that I respect. He responded and said, hey, you want to come on and we'll talk about it because I think that you're confused about some things. I responded and said class reductionism is a term deployed by people who are conscious of the fact that their politics are anti-working class. And they use it to refer to people whose politics are pro-working class because they're sort of doubling down on the anti-working class dimension of their political thought. And someone tried to argue with me about it, and I brought up immigration, organized labor's history of support for restrictionism in terms of immigration, et cetera, et cetera. And then he went and just like in quick succession, 3 different sort of positions and statements were made that illustrated to me the whole problem with the left, not class reductionism with the modern left. The problem is not class reductionism. The problem is the intersectionality and like the kind of attitude that we see exemplified by this guy who said first, if you're worried about your wages being undercut and all this kind of stuff, then screw you, you're a terrible working class, you should be replaced. And then he said, I wish I could help Mexico take back Texas and the western half of the United States. And then he went to the final step and just said, F America, burn it all down. And I was like, you not only have you illustrated my point about how people that throw this term of class reductionism around, that they are just basically committed to an anti-working class politics. Not only have you confirmed that, but you've confirmed basically everything pathological about the current left. And I hope the class reductionist people make a comeback and that they can sort of save the left and represent sort of thoughtfulness returning to left-wing political analysis and discourse and activism. But anyway, so I saw this article after that by Michael Lind, and he's a political scientist at the University of Texas at Austin, I think, and he's great. I read his newest book a couple months ago, I think, called The New Class War, and it was awesome. And I've read some really great essays by him. The other day I read an essay called, I think it was called Government Sacks, and it was about how sort of the progressive left is doing a detour around the political process and electoral politics, and sort of exerting their will on the American public actually through the corporate sector. And so, yeah, like if Goldman Sachs and all these other companies are committed to, subverting the Civil Rights Act and making sure that, like Uber Eats, they said that they would cut your delivery fee or something if you got food from a black-owned business or something like that. This kind of thing is probably illegal. But if all these companies are doing it and no one's prosecuting it, then it doesn't really matter. But the point was that policy is being created for the American public at the level of the corporation, and sort of unified assent to certain ideas that come out of the progressive left in the corporate sector. That was a very good article. You should check it out. This one's called The Double Horseshoe Theory of Class Politics, and I'm going to pull it up and talk about it in a second. But he's basing, and this is true of the book too, he sort of is coming after James Burnham, who's another thinker that I like, and whose book I just read actually, and I'm going through it again for notes. But he has this book called The Managerial Revolution, written I think in 1940, in which he tracks the New Deal in America, the Soviet Union, Soviet communism, and Russia, and Nazi Germany, and he says that these are all examples of managerial revolutions and transitions to a managerial society, which he sees as what we're coming into. The importance here for this video being the idea of the managerial class. So let me do a little background on class real quick, on the managerial class. So James Burnham is a Marx, he's coming out of a Marxist framework. He was a Trotskyist. He was a close confidant of Trotsky. And they had a kind of falling out represented by this book. And they had a long series of sort of debates about whether the revolution was still ongoing in Russia, whether Stalinism represented, the sort of natural development of it, whether it's still leading in the direction of socialism, all these issues. But he was a Trotskyist, and he retains a kind of Marx-based analysis of class and of history in the managerial revolution, although he deviates a little bit from it. But quickly about Marx and his idea of class, which also informs a lot of my thinking, although I'm not a materialist, and my analysis of politics and society is not class reductionist, you might say. But in any case, so for Marx, you have the bourgeois revolution that sort of marks the end of feudalism and the beginning of capitalism, where the bourgeoisie become the ruling class. So he sees two classes as emerging from out of capitalism. You get the bourgeoisie and you get the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the people who own the instruments of production, and then you get bourgeois property rights and things like that. The ruling ideology of capitalist countries is oriented to the protection of the bourgeoisie and bourgeois property rights. And so they own the capital, they own instruments of production, and the proletariat are the people who do the work. So the bourgeoisie buy their labor. So in terms of a traditional factory or whatever, the factory is owned by the bourgeoisie, the machines are owned by the bourgeoisie, they own the trucks that are engaged in distribution and distribution channels and all this kind of stuff, and they rent basically the proletariat buying their labor, and the labor combines with the machines and produces a product that is also owned by the bourgeoisie, even though it's a product of the labor in some sense of the proletariat. Marx talks about this in an important way, I think, in a way that makes it pretty clear. He has this MCM versus CMC idea, which is for the capitalist, this is about exchange value. So they have money, M, they buy a commodity with it, right? So they'll buy your labor or whatever, and the product of that labor, they then sell again for more money, so it gets converted back into money, and the surplus value of the labor percolates out, becomes profit, so they make more money. So they use money to buy something that then they sell and they get more money off of. Whereas normal people, the proletarian, their model is more like use value, which is CMC, right? So they have labor, they sell labor, they get money, and then they buy something else. They buy a refrigerator or whatever that has use value, it gets consumed, etc. So profit isn't involved. They don't invest in capital, etc. So, right? So in Marx's theory, in terms of his sort of historical teleology, he thinks that the immiseration of the proletariat is going to increase, and their numbers are going to increase as parts of the bourgeoisie get proletarianized, and because of that, eventually the proletarian is going to develop class consciousness and be big enough and have enough power, etc., that there's not a bourgeois revolution, but a proletarian revolution, and then you get socialism. That's Marx's idea, right? So Trotsky and Burnham are debating about what's happened in the Soviet Union, why the socialist revolution has not occurred, why they haven't developed a socialist society, etc. And Burnham's solution is an interesting one and really a Marxist one, ironically, which is that Marx has this idea that in capitalism there's a constant revolutionizing of the instruments of production that's needed in order for a profit to continue. It's part of the competitive process, all this kind of stuff. So our technology for manufacturing goods, say, however it's easiest for you to think about that. It has to constantly be revolutionized so that the process of production gets more and more efficient, more and more advanced, etc. Right? So Burnham actually says that in this constant revolutionizing of the instruments of production, and he's not the only person, by the way, that thinks about this kind of third class, which has been called by some people the new class, the new sort of industrial class or whatever, the managerial class. Recently, Barbara Ehrenreich, I think, she's talking about sort of the same thing with professional-managerial class, and that's been in a lot of articles, and if you're on Twitter, you'll see people say PMC. That's what it's referring to, basically this class. But so, and I'm sort of thinking in the context of all these thinkers, not just Burnham. But so what happens is that with the constant revolutionizing of the production process, there's an increasing alienation of the capitalist from the productive process, from production, because what's being produced, say in the transition to a knowledge economy, or when you get to doing stuff like software or whatever, not only the process of production gets too advanced for them to manage, control, all this kind of stuff, but what's being produced becomes things increasingly that they don't really know anything about, they don't have expertise about, and expertise is required. The distribution becomes so complex, the financial investments, investing into having a sort of corporate portfolio, how much gets reinvested, dealing with regulations and litigation and all this kind of stuff. Everything about the productive process gets too complex, so that the capitalist is increasingly pushed out in terms of his decision-making role, or his role as somebody who has any control over any aspect of production. And they get replaced with the managerial class, or the professional managerial class. And these are the people who have the human resources expertise, so they can manage the labor force and sort of create a worker culture that's conducive to their production. You get people who are like computer science people who know about the software, thinking about tech again, and so they can manage the process of producing the software. You get people who are experts in regulation and legal experts and all this kind of stuff, and all these people, these managers in the corporate sort of schema, are the people who are in control. And Burnham actually thinks that as the managerial revolution completes itself, these actually become all part of the state. They're state functions. Profit ceases to be a necessity for the continued operation of production, whereas in capitalism it's totally required. If you're not making a profit, you shut down, right? And he says all these functions are going to be taken over by the state. The New Deal represented a lot of that. We get the creation of a lot of different bureaus and agencies, and that's continued. People today still complain about the executive branch having accrued all this power, But I think that it's a mistake to think about that in terms of the powers of the presidency expanding, and that actually the power of the executive is expanded dramatically, but it's in these hundreds of bureaus and agencies and stuff like that. Like the EPA will make decisions about how, how warehouses are supposed to be humidified or something, right? All these decisions that are actually policy decisions, not all of them, I think, directly are involved in production, but they're all basically policy decisions. A lot of them are productive, and they're made by these unaccounted officials in the administrative bureaucracy who aren't elected, etc. So the state has accrued all of this power, and it's sort of still going that direction. And Burnham is always specific when he talks about how it doesn't really matter, whether this particular piece or that particular piece has occurred. It's the direction that matters, and we've been going this direction. But in any case, so we get this article from Michael Lind, and I'll flip over to it right now. So it's called The Double Horseshoe Theory of Class Politics, and he has some innovations over and above either the Marxist model or the managerial model and way of thinking of Burnham, although he's rooted in Burnham. So as we see, we come down here, even at the beginning, he says that in his book, the one I read, The New Class War, Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite, he offered an answer proposing that while the proletariat is still the proletariat, so he thinks the bourgeoisie has sort of undergone radical transformation, but the proletariat, in terms of Marx's capitalist sort of binary class structure, that still exists. And I just realized I forgot to say that Burnham thinks that this managerial class is like a third class in capitalism. They try to be invisible. Marx's theory isn't very able to explain the fact that Mao Zedong, Marx, Lenin, Stalin, all these people, they don't come from the proletariat. So their class identity is something other than that. So the idea that they're vying for or working on behalf of the proletariat, and they have proletarian class consciousness or something like that, it's a difficult question thinking about how that could be the case in Marx. And Burnham says it's not that complex. It's just not the case. These guys aren't proletarian, but they're not bourgeoisie. They're this third managerial class, and these classes always try to assert their own interest and get their own power. So these revolutions actually constitute not failed communist revolutions, but successful managerial revolutions. In any case, turning back to this, so he says the proletariat is still the proletariat, as James Burnham, Bruno Rizzi, John Kenneth Galbraith, and other thinkers were correct that by the mid-20th century, power passes from individual bourgeois owners to a new ruling class of technocrats or bureaucrats whose income, wealth, and status is linked to their position in large hierarchical organizations, i.e. non-profits, government agencies, industrial and financial firms, and so on. He talks about how Barbara, she uses this, he calls this group the overclass. And that's going to be important when we get to his little sort of graphical model, and I explain that. He says Barbara Ehrenreich sort of refers to them as professional-managerial class, although there are some distinctions. And he says that only the most primitive Marxists today still believe that a tiny group of individual capitalists control society from behind the scenes. It's not true anymore because power has passed on to this managerial elite. So he... Let's skip down to his... so this is his class structure. This is how he thinks about class in the United States. It's two horseshoes. You have one with the prongs facing down, and that's the overclass. And then underneath that, with the prongs facing up, that's the working class. So in the overclass, it's got this internal structure where the managerial elite are at the very top, the professional bourgeoisie are on the left, small business bourgeoisie are on the right. So let's turn to what he says about those things, just to describe them very quickly. He says the managerial elite proper, at the top, they consist of the functionaries of corporations, large investment banks, law firms, government agencies, both civilian and military, nonprofits, and universities. They may have professional degrees, but they are essentially organization men and organization women in centralized, hierarchical, bureaucratic entities. They're the chief beneficiaries of the neoliberal system set up, again, to replace the New Deal order. And the New Deal, as we saw, Burnham thinks that's the sort of beginning of the managerial revolution. And it's got other groups, two other groups. The one on the left, the professional bourgeoisie, two other groups in the overclass, I mean. The professional bourgeoisie, made up of lawyers, doctors, professors, K through 12 teachers, journalists, nonprofit workers, many of the clergy. So these are people with a lot of cultural capital and cultural influence and status. They're concentrated in the teaching, helping, and research sectors. Their jobs often pay modestly but provide the status and a degree of personal autonomy that their frequently better paid managerial functionaries actually don't have. And then on the right side, you have the small business bourgeoisie, which consists of the owner-operators of small businesses and franchises, along with genuine contractors, not gig workers. They don't count, they're part of the working class. Both those who are self-employed and those who employ others. And he says that the presence of the professional bourgeoisie on the left and small business bourgeoisie on the right is not an accident, because he actually thinks that American politics has traditionally been an intra-overclass political discussion, and that the professional bourgeoisie basically have represented what we call the left, or the Democratic Party, and the small business bourgeoisie has represented the right, or the Republican Party. And so they have, different interests accordingly. So the small business bourgeoisie, so he'll call that the center right, the whole top horseshoe being the center, in a sense. So the center right, small business bourgeoisie, they're against things like, having to pay, corporate taxes or whatever. They're against having to pay more for Social Security or for the health care of their employees. They oppose that kind of thing in favor of economic freedom, you might say. It's the economic liberals. And then on the other side, the professional bourgeoisie, their interests are, the democratic sort of interest. They're the interests of, I'll go down here. So this is very interesting. So he applies this to the current situation, right? To the Black Lives Matter stuff going on right now. And he says, the goal of so-called progressivism, and we can think about the center-left there, in 2020's America is to expand employment opportunities for college-educated center-left professionals, while adding new wings to the welfare state that are tailored to their personal needs. So that's the state taking over these functions. The slogan, defund the police, for example, which we see with Black Lives Matter, is interpreted by the bourgeois professional left to mean the transfer of tax revenues from police officers, who are mostly unionized but not college-educated, to the social service and non-profit sector and professionals in that sector who are mostly college-educated but not unionized. So it's ultimately about, again, the class vying for its own interest, the professional bourgeoisie vying for its own interest. They want jobs. They want to take the jobs from the police, basically. And so the enactment of proposals for free college education, again, and college debt forgiveness, that would disproportionately benefit them because they're sort of the primary, you have to have an education to be part of that class. It's part of the sort of credentialing is a sort of deep part of that class, whereas the small business bourgeoisie, you don't have to have a college education to be a business owner, really, but you have to have one to be a lawyer or a psychiatrist or, a professor or doing research or whatever. So they all have the degrees, so the college forgiveness would mostly benefit them, not the working class, whose education mostly ends with high school. They don't have the college degrees. So the idea that this is a really populist proposal or whatever, trying to benefit the working class, it's not true. I mean, it's a class pursuing their own class interest. He says the same thing about both parties in a two-earner professional couple. For universal daycare, it would allow both parties in a two-earner professional couple to maximize their individual incomes and individual career achievements by outsourcing the care of their children to a mostly female, less well-paid working class workforce at the taxpayer expense. So again, that's part of their own interest, right? So that's the upper horseshoe. And then we get the bottom horseshoe, which he calls the working class, and that's got three positions too. On the left is the hub city working class, on the right is the heartland working class, and on the bottom is the underclass. And this hub city heartland thing I like. It's an interesting development, I think, and he talks about it a lot in the book, The New Class War, and how different they are. Like in the hub cities, there's actually massive income inequality. This is one thing that differentiates them. And so if you're a waiter, there are different kinds of jobs. He actually says this earlier, but I don't want to find it. But the hub city people, their jobs are mostly like service sector, right? They're nannies, they're people that drive taxis, they get your groceries, they work at the store, they're waiters and waitresses. That's who the hub city working class is. That's the jobs they have. Whereas the heartland working class, they are more agriculture, industry, manufacturing, etc. And there are also these service sector jobs. But it's interesting, he notes things like in the hub city working class, when they're a waiter at a restaurant in Manhattan, for example, they can't afford to eat at the restaurant. So they'll be working, making minimum wage or close to it, and they're serving meals that are several $100s or several $1,000s even. So they're actually working, serving people who inhabit like a totally different world, basically. They have nothing in common. There's this vertical dimension to the hub city and the stratification of workers in the hub city that doesn't exist in the heartland, where I grew up, the nice place to eat was like Applebee's. And if you're a waiter at Applebee's, you make enough money to go eat at Applebee's. So this distinction, this massive disparity doesn't exist so much in the heartland. There's more of a sort of social cohesion, I guess you might say. It's more horizontally organized, where people shop at the same stores, they eat at the same restaurants, etc. And so that's an important distinction, as well as the different kinds of jobs, which makes them have very different interests as classes. That's why he differentiates them, and sometimes even competing interests. And then you have the underclass, and these are people who have multi-generational poverty, unemployment. Their communities are ravaged by crime or drugs. And so they're at the very bottom of the class structure. The managerial elite are at the very top. And he says that traditionally in American politics, this whole bottom horseshoe has been left out. Like he said, our political spectrum has mostly consisted of the professional bourgeoisie to the small business bourgeoisie. So it's been an intra-overclass, intra-bourgeoisie, intra-managerial political conversation, so that a real populism would be about trying to integrate this bottom horseshoe into American politics. That's what we'd have to do. And he says his idea, and this is in the book too, he really stresses unions, where unions and religious institutions, clergy, things like that, they used to provide the working class with some kind of input in our political process, whereas with basically the destruction of the religion and of the unions and things like that, they've been really shut out in a way that they weren't before. And yeah, I think that he gives an example. So he applies this analysis, for example, and he looks at, and this gets at a problem, one of the problems that I have actually with this model. So he talks about how there were two reopening protests, sort of. There were two protests during COVID, right, where people went out en masse and protested. In the first one, there were, he says, basically the small business bourgeoisie fighting for their interests because their businesses have been closed down, they're hemorrhaging money, maybe some of them aren't going to be able to reopen, so it's in their interest to get the economy restarted again. So they go out and they protest, and what was the result? The result was they were totally disparaged in the media. Even the health officials came out and said, this was terrible, they're committing genocide or whatever. Whereas then we get the second round of protests, which are like the defund the police type protests, which, as we saw, are in the interest of the professional bourgeoisie. And then we get the total reverse, and the media approve of it, promote it. We even got that health officials letter with, I think, hundreds of health experts and officials in the country who basically supported this second round of protests, which were in the interest of the professional bourgeoisie. And so that gets at the problem I have with this. And I do want to think more about it, and I like it in general. But I don't think he should be putting the small business bourgeoisie and the professional bourgeoisie on the same plane. Because as we saw with the protests, the culture, which again, the professional bourgeoisie has all the cultural capital. The culture, they own the media, the journalists, that they are part of the professional bourgeoisie. The health experts, they're part of the professional bourgeoisie. Doctors, professional bourgeoisie. So the culture is all, I think basically cultural reproduction that's housed in the professional bourgeoisie. So I feel like these shouldn't be on the same level, that the professional bourgeoisie really have much more power and much more influence in society than do the small business owners, who I see sort of as a relic even of the kind of capitalist world order that's obsolescing. And that when we transition fully to a managerial society, say if that's the direction we're going, I think they're basically going to be gone. And it'll be dominated by this sort of collusion between the managerial elites at the very top of the overclass and the professional bourgeoisie. And actually, Nancy Fraser, I've mentioned this in another video, but Nancy Fraser actually, when she thinks about ideology in America and in the West right now, she said that the hegemonic ideology is progressive neoliberalism. So basically, in her model, the small business bourgeoisie, I think, would be called reactionary neoliberalism. The professional bourgeoisie, they'd be called progressive neoliberalism. She says that that's the hegemonic ideology, and I think that's correct. In the past, they've mostly competed. You have, on the right of the overclass, the small business bourgeoisie, they're represented by like Bush, Romney, McCain, whatever. And on the left, it's, the Obama, Clinton, etc., right? And they've sort of competed with each other, although the culture has always been moving left. But in recent years, and this is even with Trump, the culture has become really totally dominated by the professional bourgeoisie and the managerial elite. So I don't think they should be on the same plane. That's my main issue with this. But in general, I like the model. I think it's interesting. And I suggest that you look into it, that you read about it, that you read Michael Lind. I think that class-based analyses are important, although in my mind it's not everything. And I'm not a materialist. I don't think that we should think about power only in sort of economic terms. Burnham thinks that basically whoever owns the instruments of production, that they're the ruling class in the society. And they can, that basically they give themselves preferential distribution as far as incomes. And that first the managerial elite, they get de facto control of the instruments of production because of this knowledge and expertise. And then eventually that's going to convert itself into preferential distribution of incomes, right? So he thinks about it really in sort of this economistic way, it seems like to me. Whereas I think we should also be talking about cultural production, cultural capital, social capital, etc. And if we integrate, these other kinds of non-economic analyses, then I think that the picture becomes even more clear. All of our institutions are owned and dominated not by small business bourgeoisie, but by the professional bourgeoisie and the managerial elite, mostly the professional bourgeoisie. Whether you're talking about education or the media, or entertainment industry, etc. This is all, even in government, like I said, with these agencies and bureaus that control so much. As you see with somebody like Vico, for example, and I sympathize with this idea, a society is its institutions, and that the history of society, the history of the development of societies, is the history of these institutions. And so in our society, when all these institutions are owned and controlled by a single class, basically of the professional bourgeoisie, I think it's sort of ridiculous to call the small business bourgeoisie equivalent to them in terms of power in our society. But I love Michael Lind. I think his work is great. I suggest you read his stuff and you follow him. I just want to talk a little bit about class and a little bit about how I think about class. I hope this was interesting and useful. I'm sure we'll discuss class more in the future. And I hope that the class reductionists, quote unquote, win out in the left, because I think that this is a lot more important and a lot more interesting and a lot has a lot more possibility of being really populist and uniting the working class, bringing the bottom horseshoe into political discussion if we move away from the intersectionalism increasingly. Maybe totally. That'd personally be my my view, but I'm one guy and I'm not really on the left. Although I think it's sort of complicated. Like I said, I'm influenced by Marx. I think about class and stuff in terms of Marx. I just think that that's not the whole picture. But anyway, I hope this has been interesting. Remember, don't simply react, but to think culture.